Then a single drop of rain falls onto ancient stone. The sound echoes, deep, distant, as mist curls over a mountain ridge. In the faint light of dawn, a lone figure moves through bamboo, the world around them utterly still. For 1,000 years their footsteps were never meant to be heard. They lived between war and peace, between honor and invisibility, guardians of a secret art born from survival itself. Empires rose, castles burned, and yet their discipline endured, forged not by power, but by patience. This is the untold story of the ninja, not of myth and magic, but of endurance and the human spirit's quiet defiance. It is a story of shadows that shaped history, and of silence that outlasted time. If you were there, in the mist of Iga's forests, would you walk the path of the warrior seen, or the path of the shadow unseen? Tell us below, which would call to you? Now, dim your screen, let the night close in, and step with us into the silence where legend was born. Before the name ninja existed, before Japan was divided by war and ambition, the land was a place of silence and steep mountains. The forests of Iga and Kōga were thick and ancient, layered with cedar, cypress, and mist. Villages clung to valleys like small flickers of life in a sea of green. Streams wound through rice paddies, reflecting pale light from the moon. In these secluded regions, far from the great capitals of Kyoto or Nara, the people lived by endurance. They learned to move quietly, not as warriors yet, but as farmers who knew that survival often depended on being unseen. Long before the samurai and their banners of pride, Japan's shifting clans competed not through open battle, but through cunning and local alliances. In the Heian period, when court nobles ruled in silks and whispers, power outside the palace belonged to those who understood the landscape, to mountain ascetics, hunters, and guardians of hidden paths. From these quiet lives, a philosophy began to form. That knowledge of the unseen was stronger than the display of force. The word shinobi first appeared in written records around the 8th century, drawn from the verb shinobu, meaning to endure or to conceal. The concept was not yet tied to warfare. It was a spiritual and practical way of moving through the world, blending patience, humility, and resilience. Over centuries, this idea would evolve into the art of ninjutsu, the discipline of the invisible hand. But its roots were older than strategy. They were born from nature itself, from the mountain's fog that erases footsteps, the fox's cautious stillness, the owl's silent flight. The isolation of Iga and Kōga gave these teachings space to grow. The terrain was wild and unforgiving, its ridges and forests forming a natural fortress. The people who lived there had little protection from powerful warlords, so they learned self-reliance. They crafted alliances through subtlety rather than confrontation. Villagers watched from shadows, passing information quietly. A hunter tracking game could also track soldiers. A monk studying discipline could also master disguise. Out of necessity, ordinary lives wove themselves into a fabric of secrecy. By the late Heian and early Kamakura periods, Japan's social order hardened around the rise of the samurai. Armor glinted in the sunlight of open battlefields, and loyalty to a lord became law. Yet in the mountains, another kind of discipline persisted, one that favored stillness over strength. The people of Iga and Kōga were neither rebels nor mercenaries then. They were survivors in a world that valued obedience over independence. Theirs was a different loyalty, to family, to land, to the art of remaining unnoticed. The earliest forms of ninjutsu were not systems of weaponry, but methods of movement and awareness. Practitioners studied how to pass through forests without disturbing a leaf, how to sense danger in the rhythm of sound and air. They learned to see without being seen, to hide not only their bodies, but their intentions. This discipline mirrored the natural world, where camouflage and patience decide survival. The ninja's future art would emerge from this quiet observation, a mirror of the mountain's wisdom. Legends speak of the Yamabushi, the mountain priests who practiced ascetic rituals in solitude. Clad in simple robes, they wandered peaks and forests in search of enlightenment through endurance. Many of their spiritual practices, including breathing, meditation, and the mastery of natural elements, would later influence shinobi philosophy. Their way of stillness and adaptability became the moral framework for those who would one day move unseen between castles and armies. As Japan entered the turbulent centuries that followed, the need for such skill grew sharper. Feudal lords began to turn their eyes toward the remote provinces, hungry for territory, and tribute invasions crept toward the mountains, testing the resolve of those hidden communities. Without armies or walls, the people of Iga and Kōga defended themselves with cunning, ambushes, misinformation, silent retreats. Their strength was not measured in victories, but in how long they could survive unseen. Theirs was an invisible resistance, one that left no songs or banners, only rumors carried by frightened soldiers who vanished into fog. In time, these scattered acts of endurance began to take shape as a codified tradition. Families passed on the teachings from parent to child. Secrets were memorized, not written. Herbs for healing, routes for escape, signs etched into bark or stone. Every detail mattered. In these valleys, invisibility was both protection and identity. What began as the quiet resilience of villagers would soon become a craft recognized by rulers and feared by enemies. As the 14th century drew near, Japan's peace began to crumble. The great clans of the Ashikaga and others struggled for dominance. Pulling the nation into a spiral of civil war armies, clashed, cities burned, and loyalty was traded like coin. It was an age when open battle brought ruin, but hidden knowledge brought survival. The old mountain teachings, once local and spiritual, found new purpose in espionage. Scouts, spies, and saboteurs became indispensable. From this merging of chaos and discipline, the shinobi no mono, one who endures, truly emerged. Yet even in this transformation, the essence of the shadow remained unchanged. The ninja's earliest purpose had not been conquest, but preservation. To endure meant more than to hide. It meant to adapt, to observe without hatred, to move within storms without being consumed by them. Every technique, from disguise to misdirection, carried within it a quiet wisdom. That true strength lies not in being seen, but in knowing when not to be. In Iga's misty mornings, young learners trained in silence, copying the movements of elders. They studied the terrain, the patterns of wind through grass, the distant sound travelled between stones. The world was their teacher, every lesson drawn from patience. At night, elders spoke softly of vigilance, of duty to the unseen. There were no boasts, no promises of glory, only an understanding that knowledge, when hidden, could protect generations. By the time the sun set on the medieval age's horizon, Japan stood on the edge of war once more. Castles multiplied across valleys, banners of crimson and gold flickered on every hill. But in the deep forest of Iga and Kōga, beneath the whispering leaves, the true masters of endurance continued their quiet work. Their legacy had already begun, not in chronicles or triumphs, but in the simple, enduring truth that the greatest power often moves unseen. The shadow had found its shape. The dawn of the ninja was near. As the sun rose and fell over centuries of turmoil, Japan's valleys of Iga and Kōga grew into quiet crucibles of resilience. The people who lived there were shaped by hardship and isolation, yet what they forged in silence would echo through all of Japan's history. Out of their necessity came the birth of something entirely new. Not a warrior's way of battle, but a hidden discipline of survival and intelligence. This was the beginning of the shinobi no michi, the path of the one who endures. By the early Muromachi period, the authority of the emperor and shogunate had weakened. Power splintered among regional lords, the daimyo, whose rivalries would ignite the fires of the Sengoku-era villages, caught between these feuding warlords, became battlegrounds or resources to be seized. The people of Iga and Kōga, small and surrounded by more powerful neighbors, could not hope to resist through force. Yet what they lacked in strength, they found in strategy. They turned to methods unseen on open battlefields. Messengers carried false reports. Scouts vanished into forests before soldiers could follow. Paths were designed to mislead, homes built with secret compartments and hidden exits. Over generations, this craft deepened into a structured system, a blend of survival, intelligence, and subtle warfare. The people who practiced it did not yet call themselves ninja. To them, it was simply the art of staying alive in a world that had forgotten mercy. The shinobi were not an army, but a network of families. Each clan guarded its teachings closely, passing down knowledge through oral tradition and quiet demonstration. The Hattori, Fujibayashi, and Momochi clans became especially renowned, each refining distinct aspects of the art. In Iga, terrain mastery was emphasized, using the land as both shield and weapon. In Kōga, stealth and infiltration became central, influenced by proximity to the major political centers of central Japan. Between them flowed a current of innovation, rooted in patience and observation. The techniques that defined early ninjutsu were practical, not mystical. Shinobi studied the habits of sentries, the rhythms of night patrols, and the sounds that carried on the wind. They mastered disguises, dressing as merchants, monks, or laborers to pass unnoticed. They crafted tools from simple materials, ropes that blended into tree bark, grappling hooks forged from farming implements, sandals padded with straw to muffle sound. Even the famous shuriken, often imagined as weapons of fantasy, were primarily distractions, tools to mislead the eye or delay pursuit. Central to their philosophy was kuji-in, a series of symbolic hand gestures and breathing patterns adapted from esoteric Buddhist practice. These rituals were not spells, but methods of focus, ways to steady the mind and body before danger. In them lived the same spirit that guided the mountain ascetics of old: endurance through calm, invisibility through control of self. The shinobi's training was less about combat than transformation, learning to become part of the environment, to move as naturally as mist across water. The earliest written mention of organized shinobi activity appears in chronicles of the 14th and 15th centuries. Local records from Iga describe men of stealth serving regional lords as scouts or saboteurs. Their tasks were precise: infiltration of enemy forts, the rescue of prisoners, the gathering of intelligence before battle. Unlike samurai, who prized honor through open conflict, the shinobi valued effectiveness and anonymity. A mission completed without a trace was the highest achievement. This divergence in values created both tension and dependence. Many samurai dismissed shinobi methods as dishonorable, yet could not deny their usefulness. When a castle needed to be breached, when maps of enemy terrain were required, when an assassination could change the tide of war, it was the silent specialists of Iga and Kōga, who were called through service. The ninja gained quiet influence, though rarely recognition. Their art thrived precisely because it remained hidden. Within the hidden schools of Iga and Kōga, training was lifelong. A child began by learning silence, how to breathe through the nose, how to walk without breaking twigs, how to read the shapes of clouds and predict rain. Older students studied geography, meteorology, and medicine. They memorized distances between strongholds, practiced climbing, swimming, and endurance walking. Some learned to write in code, to communicate with symbols drawn in sand or tied into cords. Others mastered poisons and antidotes, fire and smoke. Every aspect of their education reinforced a single truth: adaptability was survival. The social order of Japan viewed the shinobi with a mixture of fear and fascination. They were outsiders, neither peasants nor samurai, moving between worlds. Their anonymity made them unsettling, yet their abilities drew the attention of ambitious daimyo who sought every advantage in the wars to come. Among them was Oda Nobunaga, a rising lord whose ambition would reshape Japan. His clashes with the people of Iga would reveal both the power and the fragility of the shinobi's hidden world. In the 15th century, Iga and Kōga functioned almost as independent republics. The clans there governed themselves through councils rather than through feudal lords. Decisions were collective, based on consensus among families. This autonomy was rare in a time when most regions bowed to a single ruler. Their independence depended on unity, secrecy, and the strength of their natural defenses. Outsiders found the mountains difficult to conquer and the people impossible to control. To many daimyo, Iga and Kōga were both threat and mystery, a place where ordinary villagers could outwit professional armies. It was in this period that the art of ninjutsu reached maturity. Manuals such as the Bansen Shukai, compiled later but drawn from these traditions, would record the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The use of disguise, infiltration, diversion, and psychological warfare. But for those who lived the art, it was never written. It was practiced, whispered, embodied. The true shinobi did not speak of his craft, and the greatest among them left no trace of having existed at all. While samurai honored their swords and names, the shinobi honored silence. Their loyalty was often to balance itself, maintaining stability between warring powers, preventing destruction through intelligence and subtle influence. In this way, their contribution to Japanese history was not only martial but moral. They preserved life in the shadows so others could live in the light. Through the 15th century, as conflict deepened, the shinobi became woven into the strategies of warlords across Japan. Their networks extended beyond the mountains, reaching castles and cities, temples and roads, merchants, pilgrims, and messengers, all carried whispers of their presence. Yet to most, the ninja remained myth, figures glimpsed at dusk, half believed and half feared. Their anonymity was both armor and legacy. The birth of the shinobi was not marked by a single battle or founding. It was the slow convergence of need, skill, and philosophy. The moment when the quiet endurance of villagers transformed into a disciplined art of survival. From hidden valleys and mountain paths emerged a new kind of warrior, one who did not seek glory or command armies. Theirs was a power that existed in the spaces between moments, in the pause before movement, in the unseen breath before dawn. By the time the Sengoku era began to burn across the land, the world was ready for them. The shinobi had taken shape. Their code was unspoken, their strength unrecorded, yet their presence would soon alter the course of Japan's warring centuries, as shadows began to move beneath the banners of war. Morning in Iga began with silence. The mist that drifted through the cedar trees moved like a living thing, softening the edges of every path and roof. Within that pale stillness, life unfolded in deliberate rhythm. Farmers carried baskets to the fields. Children fetched water from the streams that ran clear and cold from the mountains. Nothing in these valleys appeared unusual to an outsider. Yet behind the ordinary cadence of daily labor, an entire world of secrets was being quietly preserved. The people of Iga and Kōga had long understood that survival depended on balance between visibility and concealment, community and independence. In times of peace, they tended their crops and honored the spirits of the mountains. In times of danger, those same fields and shrines became veils for an intelligence network unlike any other in Japan. The art of the shinobi had taken firm root here, growing naturally from the land that sheltered it. Each village was a thread in a web of understanding. The men and women who practiced ninjutsu blended seamlessly into their surroundings. Some were trained specifically for espionage, others for strategy or communication, but most lived ordinary lives, artisans, merchants, or monks whose second existence remained unseen. Trust was essential. A gesture, a glance, or a brief exchange of coded words could transfer messages across valleys without ever committing a secret to paper. Training within these hidden communities was subtle and continuous. There were no grand schools or public displays. Only quiet instruction passed from one generation to the next. A child might learn to listen to footsteps long before learning to read. Games taught stealth. Chores taught patience. Even gathering herbs in the forest became a lesson in observation. Every leaf, every scent, every echo was part of their education. The forest itself was the teacher, and the mist its constant companion. Within the families of Iga and Kōga, learning began with the body. Students practiced movement until silence became instinct. They studied how to shift their weight without sound, how to breathe with the rhythm of the wind, and how to merge their outlines with the shadows of stone or tree. From these exercises arose the discipline known as Shintai Jutsu, the art of body control. It was the physical foundation upon which all other skills depended. Mental training was equally vital. The shinobi were taught Seishin Tanrin, the tempering of spirit. Through meditation and breathing, they learned to remain calm in moments of fear, to act without hesitation, yet without anger. In the stillness of mountain temples, young disciples practiced focusing their thoughts until even the beating of the heart could be quieted. The mastery of the self was their first and greatest weapon. knowledge formed the third pillar of the shinobi's education. Geography, weather, and human behavior were studied with equal intensity. A true practitioner understood how sound traveled differently in fog, how the position of stars could guide navigation, and how people revealed more through habits than words. They were natural scientists, mapping the unseen systems that governed the world around them. Where the samurai studied battle formations, the shinobi studied the unseen connections that determined victory before a sword was drawn. In these early centuries, the distinction between soldier, monk, and spy was not always clear. Many shinobi families maintained ties with the Yamabushi, the wandering ascetics who lived in mountain hermitages. The spiritual practices of these monks, chanting, endurance rituals, and communion with nature, blended easily with shinobi philosophy. Both sought mastery through self-discipline and observation of the natural world. The difference was purpose. Where monks sought enlightenment, the shinobi sought survival and service. The landscape itself played an active role in shaping their craft. The mountains of Iga and Kōga were riddled with hidden paths and sudden cliffs. Forests gave cover, and narrow valleys allowed travelers to vanish at a turn. In such terrain, knowledge of geography was power. Shinobi used every feature to their advantage, knowing which stones shifted underfoot, where streams ran shallow, and which trees could be climbed for distant sightlines. They built hidden shelters, concealed weapon caches, and escape tunnels woven through their villages. Even a simple farmhouse might conceal a secret passage or observation slit in its walls. As their expertise grew, so did their reputation. Tales spread of figures who could appear and disappear at will, who could walk through fire or scale walls like spirits. Many of these stories were exaggerations, born from the fear and mystery that surrounded them. Yet the shinobi did little to correct such myths. Confusion was its own form of protection. The less an enemy understood, the stronger the illusion became. Deception was not cruelty, but strategy. A defense of life through the manipulation of perception. Among the techniques that became central to their craft was hensojutsu, the art of disguise. A shinobi learned to transform identity with the smallest of changes. The tilt of a hat, the color of clothing, the posture of the body. Each detail could alter how others perceived them. One day a merchant, the next a pilgrim, then a servant within a rival lord's household. Their survival depended on fluidity. Identity itself became a tool, worn lightly and shed when needed. Communication among shinobi clans required ingenuity. They developed secret codes using knots in cords, patterns of ashes left by fires, or the placement of household items visible from the road. A door slightly ajar could signal safety. A turned pot might warn of danger. Messages were sometimes hidden inside everyday objects, within bamboo segments, behind scrolls, or beneath the layers of lacquered boxes. No courier ever carried a map that could betray an entire network. Every piece of information was divided, scattered, and known fully only by a few. Despite their growing renown, the shinobi remained deeply tied to humility. Their teachings warned against pride, for attention invited danger. The concept of kage no michi, the way of the shadow, demanded invisibility not only in action but in spirit. To live without recognition was both burden and virtue. Many served their lords faithfully, without their names ever recorded. History would remember only fragments, while the true architects of those deeds disappeared into the folds of time. By the mid-15th century, As Japan slid deeper into civil unrest, the shinobi networks of Iga and Kōga reached a quiet peak. Their skills were sought by warlords across the provinces. Some served as advisors or scouts, others as covert agents or saboteurs. Through their intelligence, battles were won before they began. Castles fell not from assault, but from confusion within. Yet even as they became indispensable, their identity remained fluid, a collection of individuals bound by secrecy rather than nation or banner. The mist that cloaked their valleys became a fitting symbol. It revealed nothing yet touched everything, moving gently between the seen and unseen. Within its folds, the shinobi honed their craft and deepened their philosophy. They understood that true mastery was not about vanishing from sight, but about existing in harmony with what surrounds you, to move as naturally as the air that carries breath through bamboo and wind through grass. By the time the rest of Japan began to descend fully into war, the people of Iga and Kōga were ready. Their strength was not measured in armies or fortifications, but in quiet discipline and invisible connection. The foundation of their art had been laid, an unbroken line of endurance stretching from mountain hermits to hidden couriers, from silent watchers to unseen protectors. In every shadowed path and forest stream, their presence lingered, unseen but unforgotten. The mist would one day lift to reveal an age of fire and warlords, but for now it held the last breath of peace. Within that silence, the shinobi's world was complete, hidden, whole, and waiting. By the time the 15th century deepened into turmoil, the shinobi had perfected the quiet art of appearing as anyone and everyone. In a country divided by ceaseless conflict, where loyalties shifted with the turning of seasons, the ability to become invisible through transformation was more valuable than any blade. The shinobi's strength lay not in armor or banners, but in the fluid mastery of perception. The understanding that what others believed they saw was often more powerful than truth itself. The art of deception within ninjutsu was not born from malice, but from necessity. The provinces of Iga and Kōga had no great armies to defend their borders. Instead, they relied on the keen intelligence of those who could move among enemies unnoticed, observe their intentions, and return safely home. To survive, they learned to control how the world perceived them. This skill, the ability to alter presence, voice, and bearing, was refined into an intricate discipline known as hensojutsu, the art of disguise. A trained shinobi could transform in moments. A change of gait might turn a soldier into a traveling monk. Dust on the face, a shift in posture, or a humble bow could erase suspicion. Some learned to mimic local dialects and customs, blending seamlessly into distant provinces. Their disguise was never theatrical. It was quiet, plausible, and grounded in careful study of human behavior. They observed how farmers carried baskets, how merchants counted coins, how servants bowed. Every role required authenticity, for even the smallest inconsistency could betray the illusion. Among the most respected forms of disguise was that of the wandering ascetic. A pilgrim's robes and wooden staff granted mobility and access to temples, castles, and villages alike. Religious travelers were rarely questioned, for they carried the aura of sacred purpose. Through this persona, shinobi could move freely, gathering intelligence and observing the patterns of rival lords. Others adopted the roles of street performers, beggars, or craftsmen, using their trades as natural reasons for travel and conversation. The key to survival lay not in evasion, but in belonging everywhere and nowhere. Deception also extended to the battlefield. Before an attack, a shinobi might infiltrate an enemy camp, spreading false rumors or altering signals to sow confusion. A single misplaced banner could convince an army that reinforcements had arrived or that their flank was breached. Fires could be lit in distant hills to simulate approaching forces. Such manipulations required an understanding of psychology and timing, how fear magnifies uncertainty, and how suggestion can achieve what force cannot. To deceive effectively was to understand human nature in its most fragile form. Their tools reflected the same principle of adaptability. Each object served multiple purposes. A farmer's hoe could conceal a hidden blade. A merchant's walking stick might double as a blowgun or storage for messages. The shinobi carried small pouches of powder made from ash, soot, and ground herbs, used to blind or distract pursuers. Smoke bombs, called metsubushi, were simple yet effective, creating an instant veil that turned flight into invisibility. Fire and smoke were treated as allies, natural elements that could obscure, mislead, and divide. More subtle still were the methods of false trail and misdirection. A shinobi never moved in a straight line. They studied how to confuse trackers, walking in rivers to hide footprints, scattering sand or ash to alter impressions, even wearing special sandals that left misleading tracks pointing in the wrong direction. In written scrolls, such as the Bansen Shukai, compiled later from centuries of collected knowledge, these techniques were described with precision and restraint. Deception, it taught, was a science of control, of space, sound, and expectation. Not all deception involved disguise. The shinobi also mastered intonjutsu, the art of concealment and escape. Their training included the use of natural cover, rocks, shadows, reeds, and water. They learned to freeze completely at the approach of danger, blending into darkness or foliage until the threat passed. The ideal escape was one in which the enemy never realized pursuit had failed. The absence of evidence was the surest victory. A mission succeeded not when the enemy was defeated, but when the enemy remained unaware it had begun. To perfect these arts required immense discipline. The life of a shinobi was not glamorous. It demanded constant restraint, to hide one's skill, to suppress fear, and to maintain composure when surrounded by enemies. Many lived double lives, their neighbours unaware of their true purpose. Loyalty to one's clan meant secrecy even from friends and family. Within each household, stories and techniques were passed through whispers, coded gestures, and ritualized instruction. The knowledge of disguise, once shared, could not be taken back. Its protection was sacred duty. The deeper philosophy behind these practices rested on harmony rather than deceit. To disguise oneself was to adapt, to align one's form with circumstance. The shinobi's ideal was not to manipulate the world, but to move through it without resistance. This mirrored the teachings of Zen and Taoist thought, both of which emphasized fluidity and balance. Water, after all, flows around obstacles, yet shapes the hardest stone. So too did the shinobi seek to act without disruption, achieving goals through stillness rather than struggle. The discipline also extended to emotional control. A true master could conceal not only identity, but feeling. Anger, fear, and pride were dangers greater than any enemy. To show emotion was to reveal intent. Through meditation and self-awareness, the shinobi learned to keep expression neutral, voice steady and heart rate calm. Their power lay in subtlety, the quiet assurance that nothing could shake their balance. This composure allowed them to deceive convincingly, for belief begins in the eyes, and calmness invites trust. Across Iga and Kōga, these principles became a way of life. Even those who were not active agents absorbed the habits of discretion. A stranger's presence in a village rarely went unnoticed, yet questions were seldom asked directly. Messages travelled through ordinary acts, a shared offering at a shrine, a folded cloth left drying on a fence, the flicker of a lantern in a window. The entire region operated like a single living organism, each part aware of the other without overt communication. Disguise was no longer merely physical, it was social and cultural, a collective understanding of how to survive unseen. Stories of extraordinary acts began to circulate, blending truth and legend. Some spoke of shinobi, who infiltrated castles disguised as servants for months, feeding intelligence back to their clans. Others told of spies who escaped through underground tunnels or over walls with improvised tools made from rope and bamboo. Whether all such accounts were true no longer mattered. Their repetition reinforced the aura of mystery that protected the real practitioners. The boundary between myth and method blurred until the myth itself became another form of defense. As warlords grew in power, the shinobi services were sought by ambitious rulers across the provinces. They carried messages between allies, gathered intelligence on troop movements, and performed acts of sabotage that could alter the outcome of sieges. Yet even as they entered the machinery of war, the shinobi remained distinct from other warriors. They operated outside the codes of honor that defined the samurai. Their duty was to results, not recognition. Success meant disappearance. Their greatest victories were those that left no trace at all. Through deception, the shinobi preserved not only themselves, but their communities. Every disguise worn, every message hidden, was an act of quiet defense, a way to protect their people from annihilation in an age ruled by chaos. Theirs was not treachery, but adaptation, a mirror of nature's own resilience. As mist reshapes itself with every breeze, so too did the shinobi change form to endure. In their silence and patience lay the essence of survival. And as the fires of war began to sweep through the central provinces, that silence would soon be tested. Lords rose and fell, alliances shifted like sand, and the tranquil valleys of Iga and Kōga found themselves standing between ambition and destruction. The art of deception had prepared them well, yet no disguise could mask forever what was coming. The age of shadows was about to meet the age of war. Across Japan, the quiet balance of provinces fractured into open flame. The 16th century arrived with smoke on the horizon, and the mountains of Iga and Kōga, once havens of solitude, stood at the edge of a world consumed by war. The Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, had begun. It was an age when ambition spread faster than peace could follow, and when every castle's light burned with both promise and peril. Amid that chaos, the art of the shinobi reached its most decisive hour. The great daimyo, men of relentless will, rose and fell in rapid succession. Each sought to unite the land under a single banner, each aware that power required more than swords. Intelligence became as vital as steel. Armies could march by daylight, but the wars of information were fought in darkness, in whispered plans, coded letters, and unseen hands. The shinobi, whose methods had matured quietly in the shadowed valleys, became essential to the survival of both rebels and rulers. The people of Iga and Kōga stood apart from the tide of conquest. Their valleys were not ruled by a single lord, but by councils of families, autonomous, resilient, and wary of outsiders. For generations, their isolation had protected them. Their steep mountains discouraged invasion, and their mastery of terrain turned even small bands of defenders into formidable opponents. Yet the age of warlords was not one to respect borders drawn by custom. The ambitions of men like Oda Nobunaga would soon test the endurance of those hidden lands. In the early years of this era, the shinobi offered their services widely. Their loyalty was to contract rather than creed. They gathered intelligence, carried messages, guided armies through treacherous passes, and created diversions to mislead enemies. Some served the great houses of Takeda, Wasugi, and Hojo, while others protected their own territories from encroachment. In the confusion of endless conflict, their neutrality gave them power and danger. The more useful they became, the more others sought to control or destroy them. The art of the shinobi adapted to the new demands of war. Missions grew more complex and perilous. Infiltration of enemy castles required knowledge of architecture and timing. Spies had to memorize the layout of gates, towers, and secret passages. Sabotage became an art of precision, loosening the hinges of gates, poisoning supplies, or setting controlled fires to divide enemy attention. A single agent could change the course of a siege through careful preparation and invisible action. Shinobi records from this time describe classifications of missions: Kancho for reconnaissance, Teishin for sabotage, Kokan for infiltration, and Ansatsu for assassination. Yet even within these categories, the objective was rarely destruction for its own sake. The purpose was balance, to influence outcomes before chaos consumed all sides. Many shinobi were employed as metsuke, watchers and informants, within the armies of great lords, tasked with observing both enemies and allies to prevent betrayal. Their value lay in foresight, not violence. Weapons evolved to match their subtlety. Compact swords, often shorter than the samurai's katana, allowed swift movement through tight spaces. Hooks, ropes, and collapsible ladders replaced heavy armor fire tools. Small oil lamps, fuses, and powder packets turned night into confusion. The shinobi's true strength, however, remained in their mind, their ability to act with clarity amid panic. Where others saw walls, they saw openings. Where others sought victory, they sought survival. As the flames of war spread, stories of their exploits began to ripple outward. Armies defeated in confusion whispered of ghosts who had extinguished their torches, of enemies who struck from nowhere and vanished like wind. In the cities, rumors grew that the shinobi could walk on water, control fire, or vanish into smoke. The legends that would later define them in imagination were born in this crucible of fear and admiration. To many soldiers, defeat at night was not by mortal hands, but by shadows given form. In truth, the reality was both simpler and more remarkable. The shinobi's success came from discipline, not magic. They observed every variable: wind, light, human behavior, and acted only when the conditions were perfect. Their patience allowed them to achieve the impossible. A single unguarded moment could turn into triumph. To the untrained eye, such precision seemed supernatural, yet it was only the product of years of silent practice and unbroken focus. Among the names that began to rise from this age was that of Hattori Hanzo, a shinobi of Iga lineage who would later serve Tokugawa Ieyasu. Though many details of his life are layered in legend, he represented the fusion of stealth and strategy that defined the period. His mastery of both warfare and espionage made him invaluable in a time when alliances shifted with each battle. Figures like Hanzo bridged the old world of isolated clans and the emerging realm of centralized power, where the ninja would move from secrecy to history. The fire of the Sengoku period did not spare Iga or Kōga. As neighboring provinces fell under the control of powerful daimyo, the independence of the shinobi republics drew attention and envy. Their valleys, once dismissed as remote, became prized for their strategic value. Control of the central routes between Kyoto and the eastern lands meant control of communication and supply. The same qualities that had protected Iga, isolation, unity, and hidden strength, now made it a target. The first incursions came quietly. Small forces sent to test defenses returned with tales of invisible resistance. Ambushes that struck from the mist, traps that appeared where no men had been seen. For a time, Iga and Kōga held their ground through ingenuity. They used terrain as weapon and illusion as shield. But as Nobunaga's power expanded, his armies brought methods far beyond the capacity of mountain villages. In the year 1579, he sent his son, Oda Nobukatsu, to subdue Iga. The campaign failed. The defenders repelled the invasion through ambushes and deception, using every path and shadow to their advantage. The victory was fleeting, but it became legend, a testament to the resilience of the shinobi clans. 2 years later, Nobunaga returned with overwhelming force. Tens of thousands of soldiers marched on the valleys of Iga, burning villages and forests alike. Against such fire, even the most skilled could not prevail. Many shinobi fled into the mountains or took refuge with sympathetic lords. The fall of Iga marked the end of its independence, but not the end of its people. Those who survived carried their knowledge across Japan, scattering seeds of their art into new lands and new purposes. In the ashes of their homeland, the shinobi adapted once more. Some entered the service of emerging leaders such as Tokugawa Ieyasu, lending their expertise to a new vision of unity. Others disappeared entirely, vanishing into legend. The art of stealth endured not as rebellion, but as wisdom. The understanding that even in defeat, survival is its own form of victory. The age of warlords would eventually forge the modern shape of Japan, uniting the islands under one rule. But in its burning heart, amid the clash of banners and the fall of castles, the shinobi had fulfilled their quiet destiny. They had proven that knowledge could stand against armies, and that silence, when disciplined and purposeful, could alter the course of history. As the smoke cleared from the valleys, the mountains of Iga stood dark against the sky. Once more, mist rose to cover the scars of battle. Beneath that mist, memory lingered, of men and women who had lived as shadows, moving through fire without being consumed. Their world had changed, but the essence of their craft remained. It would wait patiently in silence, ready to re-emerge when the world once again forgot the value of the unseen. The wars that reached the valleys of Iga and Kōga were unlike any that Japan had known. They were not fought only with swords and fire, but with whispers, deception, and quiet endurance. Beneath the grand battles that shook the nation, an invisible struggle unfolded, one waged by those who fought without banners, who guarded their homes through secrecy and knowledge of the land. These were the silent wars, remembered not in chronicles of glory, but in the breath of mist that still clings to the mountains where the shinobi once walked. After the first great invasion of Iga in 1579, the people of the region had earned a fragile reprieve. Their defense against Oda Nobukatsu's forces became a story of impossible resistance. Farmers defeating samurai through cunning and terrain. It was not strength that saved them, but the mastery of invisibility. The invaders had marched in with confidence, expecting an easy conquest, and found instead a maze of ambushes, false trails, and vanishing enemies. For a brief moment, the mountains of Iga stood unconquered, their silence victorious over fire. But victory brought peril. The triumph of Iga did not go unnoticed. In the castles of Kyoto and Owari, Oda Nobunaga took the defeat as a personal insult. The independence of Iga was an affront to his vision of a unified Japan. In his mind, no corner of the realm could remain outside his control. So he prepared to return, not with a probing force, but with an army vast enough to erase Iga from memory. The year 1581 marked the beginning of what would later be called the Tensho Iga War. Tens of thousands of Nobunaga's troops moved toward the mountains, surrounding the valleys from every direction. Against such force, even the combined defenses of Iga's families could not hold. They knew the land better than any invader, yet no strategy could overcome the weight of numbers and the firepower of matchlock guns that had begun to change the nature of war. Still, the shinobi resisted. Villages emptied into the forests. Secret paths, long memorized by generations, became lines of retreat and counterattack. Scouts moved under cover of darkness, striking supply lines, freeing captives, and spreading false orders among the enemy ranks. It was a war of patience and attrition, of deception woven into every hour. Fires burned on the ridges at night, signals of warning or misdirection, their meaning known only to those who lived by the code of endurance. For months, Iga became a place of shifting smoke and broken silence. The shinobi fought not for conquest, but for survival itself. Every farmhouse, every hidden cave became a fortress. Families scattered to neighboring provinces. Some took refuge in Kōga, whose terrain and people shared their kinship. Others fled east to Mikawa and beyond, finding service among the armies of rival lords. Through these exiles, the art of ninjutsu began to spread more widely across Japan. What had been a regional discipline rooted in mountain life became a network that reached from castle to castle, carried by refugees of a lost homeland. When the campaign ended, Iga lay in ruins. Villages were burned, temples destroyed, and the fields salted with ash. Nobunaga declared the region pacified, but the silence that followed was not submission. The people of Iga endured quietly, rebuilding their homes beneath the watch of new governors. The shinobi who survived blended once more into ordinary life, concealing their art behind the work of farmers, craftsmen, and messengers. Outwardly, they appeared subdued. Inwardly, they remained bound by memory. The unbroken thread of their discipline hidden beneath the ashes. Kōga, though spared the same devastation, faced its own trials. The proximity to Kyoto made the region a corridor of political intrigue. Shinobi from Kōga were often drawn into service as spies for rival daimyo, their skills exploited in the endless chess game of court and battlefield. They gathered intelligence for the Asakura, the Azai, and the Rokaku clans, moving quietly through shifting alliances. When Nobunaga extended his influence toward Kyoto, many Kōga shinobi found themselves serving both sides at different times, a reflection of their pragmatic code. Their loyalty was to balance, not ambition. Among these shifting loyalties, certain figures emerged as symbols of endurance. Momochi Sandayu, a leader of Iga tradition, was said to have survived the fall of his homeland and continued his teachings in secrecy. Whether myth or truth, his name became synonymous with perseverance, a reminder that the way of the shadow could not be extinguished by conquest. Another, Fujibayashi Nagato, preserved the knowledge of ninjutsu in written form, ensuring that even as the clans scattered, their wisdom would endure. His descendants would later compile the Bansen Shukai, the most comprehensive record of shinobi arts, decades after Iga's fall. Through these survivors, the art evolved into something quieter and more philosophical. The shinobi who once fought for land now fought for preservation, of memory, of skill, of purpose. They adapted once more, finding refuge under new masters who valued their discretion. The Tokugawa family, still a rising power, became one of their most important allies. The connection forged between Ieyasu Tokugawa and the remnants of Iga would one day shape the political destiny of Japan itself. In the years that followed Nobunaga's death in 1582, the balance of power shifted again. His downfall at Honnoji created a vacuum that others rushed to fill. Amid the chaos, the surviving shinobi of Iga and Kōga guided Tokugawa Ieyasu safely across hostile territory, an act that would ensure their legacy. Their intimate knowledge of the land allowed him to evade pursuit and return to his home province. In gratitude, Ieyasu brought many of them into his service, granting new life to a people who had nearly vanished. The shadows that once defended hidden valleys now guarded the path of Japan's future shogun. The silent wars of Iga and Kōga were never recorded as victories, yet their outcome reshaped the history of the nation. Through loss and exile, the shinobi transcended the confines of their birthplace. They became symbols of adaptability, of how knowledge can survive destruction, and how silence can carry wisdom farther than war. Their traditions no longer belong to one province, but to an idea that strength lies not in domination, but in the understanding of when to move unseen. By the dawn of the 17th century, the flames that had ravaged the land began to cool. The era of constant conflict drew to an end, giving way to the stability of the Tokugawa shogunate. The warriors who once thrived in chaos found new purpose in peace. Yet within that peace, the lessons of the shinobi remained valuable. They became guards, informants, and protectors of the very order that war had nearly destroyed. In their silence, they continue to shape the future, not through fear or subversion, but through vigilance and restraint. The valleys of Iga and Kōga never regained their former independence, but their memory lived on. The mountains healed, the villages returned, and in the stillness of night, one might still sense the unseen presence of those who once defended the land without fame or recognition. The mist that had hidden them for centuries drifted again through the cedars, carrying whispers of endurance, the soft breath of history that never truly fades. The silent wars had ended, yet the world that they created, a world of patience, subtlety, and quiet power, endured long after the smoke cleared. In the story of Japan's unification, their mark remained invisible but indelible, like footprints pressed into the soil beneath morning fog. And in the still air above those valleys, where dawn once revealed the scars of conquest, the spirit of Iga and Kōga lingered, calm, waiting, and eternal. When peace briefly returned to the valleys, the remnants of Iga and Kōga carried with them a legacy that had been forged in silence and shadow. The fires of war had passed, yet the craft of the shinobi endured, not as rebellion now, but as knowledge, preserved carefully like a flame sheltered within the hand. In the stillness that followed centuries of chaos, their tools, their movements, and their philosophy became objects of quiet reverence. The age of survival had shaped an art form, and within its discipline lay both the physical and spiritual heart of the ninja. The world imagined their weapons as instruments of death, yet, to the shinobi, every blade, rope, and tool had another meaning: versatility, adaptability, and restraint. Their implements were not made for conquest, but for control of the body, of the surroundings, of the very moment between action and silence. When night settled over the land and the moon hung pale above rice fields and bamboo groves, the glint of steel beneath its light was rarely a sign of violence. More often, it was the quiet reassurance of readiness. Among their tools, the most recognized was the ninjato, the short, straight-bladed sword often attributed to the ninja. Yet historians suggest that few such swords existed in reality. Most shinobi carried whatever blade was practical: short wakizashi or cut-down katana, easier to draw quickly in confined spaces. The straight sword, popularized later in art and theatre, symbolized efficiency rather than ornament. It was easier to forge, lighter to carry, and less conspicuous when hidden beneath a cloak or within a walking stick. Its sheath might hold small compartments for powders, cords, or documents, turning an ordinary weapon into a multi-tool of survival. In combat, the shinobi valued precision over strength. They were taught to strike only when necessary, and only to create escape or achieve the mission's goal. Killing was a failure of subtlety. A mission completed without violence was considered perfection. Techniques such as taijutsu, the art of unarmed movement, emphasized redirection and balance. A shinobi learned to move with minimal noise, to use the opponent's momentum rather than force against them. Every motion flowed from observation, the patience of one who had studied not only bodies, but the rhythm of life itself. Beyond the blade, the shinobi's arsenal reflected their creativity. Hooks and ropes allowed them to ascend walls or cross rivers silently. Compact ladders, collapsible into segments of bamboo, could be carried on the back and extended in moments. Their footwear, soft-soled jikatabi, allowed firm footing and quiet steps across stone or wood. Even their clothing was engineered for purpose. The image of the all-black outfit, known today as shinobi shozoku, likely emerged later, but its foundation lay in practicality: dark indigo or brown, colors that blended with night and earth. Each layer was designed for function, not fear. Fire, too, was a companion of the shinobi. In an age when darkness offered both cover and danger, mastery of flame became essential. They carried small oil lamps, fuses, and powders mixed from sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal. These could ignite sudden bursts of light or smoke, confuse pursuers, or send signals across valleys. Haijutsu, the art of fire, required both caution and precision. It was not destruction that the shinobi sought, but distraction, a way to bend perception, to control the tempo of pursuit or battle. The glow of a false fire on a distant hill could divert entire armies from their path. Among their most iconic devices were the shuriken, the throwing blades that later became emblems of the ninja's image. In truth, these were rarely used as killing weapons. Small, often star-shaped or needle-like, they served to wound, distract, or delay. A sharp edge in flight could draw an enemy's attention, create a sound, or buy a single crucial breath of time for the shinobi. That moment's hesitation could mean escape. The weapon's value was psychological, a reminder that fear, not force, was often the most potent ally in the shadows. Poison and medicine shared a curious harmony in the shinobi's craft. Knowledge of herbs, minerals, and their effects was considered essential. They understood which roots could heal wounds, which plants numbed pain, and which leaves brought sleep or disorientation. This knowledge came from centuries of mountain life, learned from monks, hunters, and healers. A single herb could save or destroy, depending on intent. In skilled hands, even nature's simplest elements became tools of preservation and control. Perhaps the most defining quality of the shinobi's equipment was its concealment. Every object had multiple purposes. A flute might hold darts. A scroll case could hide a blade. The design of these tools reflected a world view. That power need not announce itself. To be effective was to be unseen, to act without altering the world more than necessary. Their entire arsenal mirrored the natural principle that underpinned their philosophy, that adaptability is strength. Training in these techniques demanded patience beyond measure. Apprentices practiced in darkness until they could move without sight. They learned to listen for the faintest change in air, to recognize the shift of fabric, the breath of another's presence. They climbed trees and walls until their hands knew every texture by touch. Many exercises were not of combat, but of endurance, holding stillness for hours, crossing streams without a ripple, or walking through dry leaves without sound. The perfection of silence became a form of prayer, an offering to the discipline that sustained them. Philosophically, the weapon was considered an extension of the spirit. A sword or tool reflected the wielder's mind. If the mind was clouded, the blade moved erratically. If the heart was calm, movement became effortless. In this way, the shinobi's mastery of weapons paralleled the spiritual balance sought by monks and ascetics. They did not worship violence but harmony, the alignment of body, tool, and purpose. A true practitioner used the least possible force to achieve the greatest result. Artisans who crafted these tools were themselves keepers of secrecy. Blacksmiths in Iga and Kōga worked quietly, often producing ordinary farming implements by day and specialized equipment by night. The knowledge of metallurgy and design was passed along trusted family lines. Every hinge, hook, and clasp carried lessons in discretion. The weapons of the shinobi were not ornate. They bore no inscriptions or marks of pride. Their beauty lay in simplicity, tools that disappeared into the fabric of daily life. Even in times of peace, the shinobi maintained their readiness. They kept their tools hidden, their senses honed, their movements deliberate. The moonlight that once reflected from polished steel became a reminder rather than a threat, a symbol of vigilance without aggression. To live as a shinobi was to walk a narrow path between two worlds, the visible and the invisible, the ordinary and the extraordinary. Their blades may have rested, but the discipline remained alive in every breath and every step. As Japan approached a new era under Tokugawa rule, the age of constant warfare began to fade. Yet the essence of the shinobi's craft, quiet awareness, restraint, and adaptability, would continue to shape their identity in the decades to come. The tools of survival would soon become instruments of watchfulness, their purpose shifting from battlefields to the corridors of peace. The moon that once guided them through the smoke of burning provinces now rose over calm fields and distant cities. Beneath its silver glow, the memory of their craft endured, sharp, silent, and eternal, like a blade waiting patiently beneath the light. When the fires of war cooled and the smoke drifted away from the valleys, what remained was not ruin, but reflection. The men and women of Iga and Kōga had survived centuries of chaos through more than stealth and skill. Beneath the physical art of movement and disguise lay a deeper current, a philosophy shaped by stillness, endurance, and awareness of nature's quiet order. It was a way of thinking that turned survival into meditation and invisibility into wisdom. The shinobi called it nin, a word that meant both endurance and the heart held in patience. In the new age that followed unification, the shinobi found themselves without constant battle. The Tokugawa shogunate brought peace, and with peace came silence of another kind, a silence that tested the soul more than any enemy's blade. No longer needed for constant warfare, many shinobi turned inward, preserving their discipline as a spiritual practice rather than a profession. The skills that once saved lives on the battlefield became lessons in perception, adaptability, and humility. They began to see their art not as a trade of shadows, but as a path through life. The philosophy that had sustained them during centuries of hardship was rooted in balance. To the shinobi, wind was the perfect teacher. It could not be seen, yet its presence shaped everything. It bent the tallest trees and whispered through the narrowest cracks, powerful precisely because it never resisted its own nature. To live by the way of wind was to move without conflict, to pass through the world without leaving turbulence behind. This ideal became the moral foundation of the shinobi, guiding not only their missions, but their thoughts. From early training, practitioners were taught to observe the world as if detached from it, to notice without judgment, to act without haste. Every movement had meaning, every pause a purpose. The mind of a shinobi was trained to remain clear, as still water reflects the sky. The old mountain ascetics, the Yamabushi, had taught similar lessons. That mastery of the self precedes mastery of the world. Through controlled breathing, meditation, and deliberate motion, the shinobi sought to harmonize with the forces that surrounded them. Wind, rain, earth, and shadow alike. This harmony extended to perception. The shinobi learned that reality was not fixed, but fluid, shifting according to perspective. To survive, one had to see through illusion, both the illusions of others and the illusions within. In this sense, deception was never merely an external tactic. It was also an internal discipline. To deceive effectively, one first had to know the truth clearly. To hide one's presence, one had to understand the nature of presence itself. The training was not about trickery, but about perception sharpened until it became art. Within Iga and Kōga, elders spoke often of ninshiki, awareness. It was said that the most accomplished shinobi could sense a presence behind them, read emotion from the sound of footsteps, or predict the weather from a single gust of air. These were not supernatural gifts, but the product of endless observation, the quiet science of attention. To watch the world so closely that nothing escaped the senses was both protection and enlightenment. The shinobi who achieved this state became as fluid as the elements themselves. The principle of patience formed the other half of their philosophy. To wait without restlessness, to endure without resentment. This was considered the highest form of strength in battle. Patience could mean survival. In life, it meant clarity. The shinobi's training in endurance was physical at first. Long nights without sleep, hunger borne without complaint, movement through storm and cold. Yet beneath these trials lay a deeper lesson. Endurance was not only the ability to withstand suffering, but the ability to remain inwardly calm, regardless of circumstance. The heart that did not waver became unassailable. Over time, this discipline evolved into a worldview that resembled both Zen and Taoist thought. The shinobi saw all forces as part of a natural cycle. Conflict followed by peace, gain followed by loss. The wise did not cling to victory nor despair in defeat, for both were fleeting. To move through life as the wind moves through the forest was to remain free of attachment. It was said that the perfect shinobi left no trace, not only in the world, but in the hearts of others. They acted without imprint. Their influence carried onward like air after a passing breeze. This detachment did not mean indifference. The shinobi valued loyalty, compassion, and the preservation of life. Their patience allowed them to see beyond anger, to act with purpose rather than impulse. They believed that violence, though sometimes necessary, must always serve balance. Every action carried weight, and the greatest mastery lay in choosing when not to act. The restraint that once made them formidable in war became a quiet form of wisdom in peace. Among the scrolls that recorded their teachings, a few passages survive describing this philosophy. One such text, later known as the Shoninki, written by a shinobi from Kishu province, emphasized sincerity and self-discipline as the foundation of true ninjutsu. It warned against arrogance, deceit for personal gain, and cruelty. The shinobi's deception was to serve harmony, not ambition. The mind, it said, must be as still as the moon's reflection in water, disturbed by nothing, yet illuminating all. Such lines captured the essence of their worldview. Invisibility as mindfulness, not trickery. The discipline of patience also guided their approach to knowledge. The shinobi studied the smallest details. The pattern of ripples in a pond, the way smoke moved in air, the habits of animals and the behavior of men. Every fragment of the world offered insight if observed without haste. This patience extended to communication. A message might take weeks to deliver, but its meaning would be perfect when it arrived. A plan might require years to mature, but when executed, it would unfold like a seed planted long ago in fertile ground. In the quieter years of Tokugawa peace, many shinobi found their place within society as guards, messengers, and advisors. Their training in awareness made them skilled in diplomacy and observation. The old art that had once served war now maintained order. The way of wind, flexible, silent, and enduring, proved as vital in peace as in conflict. The lessons of the past had not vanished. They had transformed, as the wind changes direction yet remains the same. For the younger generations, who grew up in these peaceful times, the practice of ninjutsu became both heritage and meditation. The movements once used to evade enemies now trained focus and calm breathing exercises became rituals of mindfulness. Through the preservation of their ancestors' teachings, they maintained a connection to nature and to the discipline of self-awareness that had once defined their survival. In this way, the shinobi spirit endured not as rebellion, but as harmony, a philosophy that transcended purpose. To those who inherited the legacy of the mountains, the meaning of nin, endurance, remained sacred. It was more than secrecy or survival. It was the expression of life lived deliberately, without haste, without noise. In quiet strength, the wind passed over the land without leaving scars. So too did the true shinobi pass through history, unseen yet unforgotten. As the centuries shifted, the valleys grew quieter, and the art that had begun in mist and hardship became a whisper carried by generations. Yet its heart, patience, awareness, balance remained unchanged. The way of wind endured, gentle and eternal, moving through the folds of time with the same soft persistence that had carried it through fire and war. And when night returned to those valleys, the wind still rose between the cedars, whispering the same lesson it had taught for centuries. That power lies not in force, but in stillness, in the quiet strength of those who endure. When peace settled over Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate, the sound of battle faded from the valleys. The age of roaring banners and burning provinces came to an end, replaced by an age of quiet order. Yet beneath that surface calm, new forms of vigilance took root. The art of the shinobi did not vanish with war's passing. It evolved, reshaped by the needs of peace. No longer moving through forests and mountains, many now walked through corridors of stone and paper. The shadows that once drifted across the battlefield entered the castle walls. The early 17th century was a time of reconstruction and control. The Tokugawa family, led by Ieyasu, sought to unify not only the land but the spirit of the nation. Every domain owed loyalty to the shogun, and every lord was watched carefully to ensure that allegiance remained unbroken. Order depended upon information, and information depended upon eyes that could see without being seen. For this, the shogunate turned to the descendants of Iga and Kōga, the men and women whose ancestors had survived the silent wars. They were no longer soldiers of rebellion, but keepers of security. Within Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka, they served as guards, intelligence gatherers, and messengers. Their duties were subtle, observing the mood of visiting lords, reporting unrest among servants, protecting the shogun's inner chambers from infiltration. These positions were not public, nor were they celebrated. The shinobi existed quietly within the machinery of governance, their presence felt only in the smooth functioning of order. They became the invisible threads that held the peace together. Among the most trusted of these figures were those who had once aided Tokugawa Ieyasu in his perilous escape after the fall of Nobunaga. Their loyalty had been proven in the darkest hours, and the new shogun repaid it with enduring trust. The Igamono, as they were known, formed a small yet vital part of the Tokugawa security apparatus. Under the leadership of families such as the Hattori, they guarded the gates and halls of Edo Castle, ensuring that the center of power remained untouchable. The name Hattori Hanzo, already steeped in legend, became a symbol of silent vigilance. Though the man himself had long passed, his descendants continued his duty for generations. Life within the castle was one of constant awareness. The shinobi stationed there lived among courtiers, soldiers, and attendants, moving quietly between them without drawing notice. They listened more than they spoke, reading the tone of conversation, the shifting alliances between retainers, the faintest sign of discontent. Their tools were no longer ropes and grappling hooks, but memory and observation. A gesture, a whisper, the placement of a letter, all could carry meaning. Their art had become psychological, a mastery of human pattern and intent. Even in times of peace, danger lingered. Ambition could stir beneath polite smiles, and secrets could travel faster than messengers. The shinobi's task was not merely to uncover plots, but to prevent them from forming. They acted as unseen intermediaries, correcting misunderstandings before they became treason, delivering warnings before anger turned to action. The goal was not punishment, but preservation. Their silence maintained harmony where open confrontation would have caused ruin. Within castle walls, every structure carried symbolic meaning. The layers of gates, moats, and chambers mirrored the layers of protection within the shogunate's rule. At the heart of this labyrinth lay the shogun's private quarters, a sanctum few could approach. The Iga guards patrolled these innermost paths, their presence both practical and ceremonial. They wore the robes of attendants, their weapons discreet. Their loyalty was absolute, their vigilance constant. In stillness they watched over an empire of stillness. Outside the capital, other shinobi continued their service in different forms. Some worked as couriers, carrying confidential messages between distant domains. Others trained as investigators, known as metsuke, tasked with observing the conduct of officials. Their reports traveled in secrecy, written in code or delivered orally to ensure they could never be intercepted. Trust was their currency, and it was earned through decades of discretion. The power they held was quiet, yet immense, the ability to reveal truth without ever being seen to speak it. The transformation of the shinobi from warrior to watcher reflected the changing nature of Japan itself. The chaos of the Sengoku era had taught the nation the price of disorder. Peace now required a different kind of discipline, one that valued patience and perception over courage and steel. The shinobi embodied this transition perfectly. They had once thrived in chaos. Now they ensured that chaos would never return. Their endurance had found new purpose in peace. Though their presence within society was concealed, echoes of their craft remained visible in everyday life. Many of the shogunate's intelligence methods drew upon the principles of ninjutsu, the control of information, the careful design of communication networks, and the cultivation of psychological understanding. Even the architecture of major castles reflected shinobi influence. Hidden rooms, secret passages, and narrow corridors for silent movement became common features, not merely for defense, but for maintaining discretion within the complex hierarchy of court life. Outside the centers of power, small groups continued to preserve the older teachings in private. In remote villages and mountain temples, scrolls were copied, breathing techniques practiced, and the wisdom of patience passed to new generations. These practitioners no longer called themselves spies. They were caretakers of knowledge. Some adapted their skills into new disciplines, martial arts that emphasized awareness and evasion, or philosophies of mindfulness and endurance. The essence of the shinobi lived on, even as their name faded from daily speech. Yet the balance of secrecy carried its own loneliness. To live unseen was to exist on the edge of history. The shinobi of the Tokugawa age performed their duties faithfully, knowing that recognition would never come. They walked through corridors of power as shadows among men of fame. Their silence was both their shield and their exile. But within that silence lay peace, the calm acceptance that their work preserved something greater than themselves. As decades passed, the once feared figure of the ninja transformed in the imagination of the people. Stories began to circulate, tales told by traveling performers, theatre plays filled with intrigue and disguise. The line between fact and legend began to blur again. The real shinobi remained invisible, but their image took on a new life in art and folklore. The people, no longer seeing them in the world around them, recreated them in stories of mystery and night. The shadow within the castle walls became a shadow within memory. Through these transformations, the philosophy of patience and balance endured. The shinobi of peace had become guardians not of land or power, but of order itself. They embodied the quiet truth that true vigilance requires humility. Their art had always been about control, not of others, but of the self. To serve without being known, to protect without being praised. This was the purest expression of endurance. In the long stillness of the Tokugawa era, when Japan closed its borders and the centuries of conflict faded into quiet prosperity, the unseen watchers remained at their posts. They aged in silence, trained their successors, and passed away without monument or record. Yet in the smooth governance of the shogunate, in the calm of a unified land, their influence persisted. Like air within walls, their presence was everywhere and nowhere. And when night fell upon the castles they guarded, and the lanterns burned low along corridors of wood and paper, a faint whisper of movement sometimes stirred, soft as breath, light as thought. The old ways lived on in that whisper, in the awareness that peace endures only while someone remains awake in the dark. The centuries of peace that followed Tokugawa unification reshaped Japan in ways that even the wisest could not have foreseen. The smoke of war vanished from the sky, and with it, the urgency that had once defined the lives of the shinobi. The castles they had guarded stood tranquil beneath wide blue skies. Roads became safe, towns flourished, and the rhythms of life slowed to a steady calm. Yet beneath that harmony, silence deepened, the kind of silence that comes not from danger, but from forgetting. For the clans of Iga and Kōga, peace was both salvation and quiet erasure. The shinobi had endured centuries of conflict through secrecy, adaptability, and purpose. But peace brought a paradox. The very success of their art ensured that it would no longer be needed. Their missions dwindled. Their services as spies and guards, once essential to survival, became vestiges of a vanished age. The shogunate maintained its intelligence networks, but the extraordinary skills of the shinobi were slowly absorbed into ordinary administration. The shadow that had once stretched across battlefields now rested quietly beneath the sunlight of stability. In the valleys of Iga and Kōga, families that had once lived as secretive republics found new lives as ordinary citizens. The fields that had hidden warriors now grew rice undisturbed. The tools of stealth were stored away, their iron coated in oil to resist time. Children who once trained to walk without sound now learned to write, to trade, and to farm. Yet in many homes, behind paper screens and within quiet rooms, the memory of the old ways lingered. Not as a profession, but as a form of identity. The knowledge of patience, awareness, and adaptability remained the inheritance of these mountain people. Old masters, too aged to serve the shogunate, continued to record what they knew. Scrolls were written in careful brushstrokes, not for power, but for preservation. Among these works, 3 became legendary in later generations: the Bansen Shukai of Fujibayashi Yasutake, the Shoninki of Natori Masazumi, and the Ninpiden attributed to Hattori Hanzo. Though written decades apart, they formed a triad of reflection. Manuals not of warfare alone, but of philosophy, strategy, and self-discipline. They gathered centuries of quiet knowledge into ink and paper, ensuring that even as the clans faded, their spirit would not. The Bansen Shukai, compiled around 1676, was the most comprehensive of these texts. It described every element of the shinobi's craft: disguise, infiltration, fire, water, psychology, and moral conduct. Yet beneath its detailed instructions ran a current of humility. The true shinobi, it taught, acts with benevolence in his heart. Deception was a means, not an end. The goal was balance, to restore harmony where open conflict could not. This tone of reflection revealed how far the art had evolved. What had begun as a survival skill in the mountains had become a philosophy of restraint and harmony within civilization. In the Shoninki, Natori Masazumi, a former retainer of the Kishu domain, wrote candidly about the changing times. He warned that many who claimed the title of ninja no longer understood its meaning. For him, ninjutsu was not about trickery or violence, but the cultivation of the mind. The shinobi's strength, he wrote, is found in clarity, sincerity, and the refusal to be led by impulse. His words were not of rebellion, but of integrity. An attempt to preserve dignity in an age when their purpose had grown faint. Within Iga and Kōga, such writings became treasured family heirlooms. The once great networks of communication, the codes and alliances that had spanned provinces, quietly dissolved. Yet the valleys retained their aura of mystery. Travelers still whispered that the people of these regions could see farther, move quieter, and know more than they revealed. Pilgrims passing through claimed to sense an invisible watchfulness in the woods. Whether real or imagined, the reputation of the shinobi endured long after their political role had faded. The decline of the clans did not bring bitterness. Many accepted the change as part of the natural order. Their philosophy had always taught that strength lies in adaptation, that to endure is to transform. So they adapted again, not into warriors, but into teachers, healers, and craftsmen. Some turned their precise awareness toward the study of medicine, becoming skilled herbalists and physicians. Others became bodyguards, martial instructors, or administrators for local lords. A few even became monks, retreating into the same mountains that had once trained them, seeking enlightenment in silence rather than victory in secrecy. The Tokugawa peace, lasting more than 2 centuries, created a world where invisibility was no longer an act of defense, but a way of life. The shogunate discouraged social mobility, binding each person to their station: samurai, farmer, artisan, or merchant. For the descendants of the shinobi, whose ancestors had lived between classes, this rigidity presented both challenge and opportunity. Some registered as lower-ranking samurai, preserving fragments of their status. Others lived as peasants, their lineage unspoken but remembered within the family. The shadow identity persisted quietly, passed in stories whispered to children by firelight. Legends began to replace history. The names of Hattori, Momochi, and Fujibayashi became mythic. Tales exaggerated their abilities, walking on water, vanishing in smoke, controlling elements. The real teachings of discipline and endurance transformed into the symbols of folklore. In this way, the forgotten shinobi entered immortality. The world no longer needed their presence, so it created their image instead. What the hand released, imagination preserved. While the outer world forgot them, within their villages, rituals of remembrance remained. Festivals honoring ancestors often included subtle gestures, a silent bow toward the mountains, a candle placed beside a blade too old to wield. Elders still taught lessons of patience and restraint, though they called them by gentler names. The art of endurance became morality. The art of invisibility became modesty. What once was survival now became virtue. The teachings had shed their armor but kept their spirit. As generations passed, Japan began to stir again. Foreign ships appeared on the horizon, and whispers of change drifted through the air. The rigid peace of Tokugawa rule would not last forever. Yet even as the outer world prepared to awaken, the valleys of Iga and Kōga remained tranquil. The people there had seen empires rise and fall, and they had learned that the rhythm of history is a cycle of noise followed by silence. They had chosen silence. By the mid-19th century, when the winds of modernization swept through Japan, the last direct practitioners of ninjutsu had grown old. Their descendants spoke of ancestors who had once served shoguns and emperors, but the meaning of those stories had softened into heritage. A few preserved old scrolls, faded and brittle, their ink carrying the thoughts of centuries. Others practiced martial exercises drawn from forgotten techniques, unaware of the lineage that shaped them. The shadow of the shinobi had become the outline of memory. Yet in that memory lived something enduring. Though their names faded and their roles dissolved, the essence of the shinobi, adaptability, patience, and unseen strength, remained within the character of the people. Their philosophy, born in hardship, had blended seamlessly into the soul of a peaceful nation. The true victory of the shinobi was not in surviving battle, but in leaving a wisdom so subtle that it became invisible within the culture it once protected. In the stillness of Iga's forests, the cicadas continued their song. The earth covered the remains of old watchtowers, and moss crept over forgotten paths. But in the rhythm of the wind through the bamboo, one could still hear the quiet echo of those who had lived by patience and passed into myth. The final whisper of the fallen clans who had taught the world that silence too has power. The long centuries of Tokugawa peace stretched like a quiet dream across Japan. For more than 200 years, the islands knew no large-scale war. The clamour of swords was replaced by the rhythm of daily life, markets opening with dawn, temples ringing their bells, and farmers tending to rice fields that shimmered beneath the sun. The valleys of Iga and Kōga, once the crucibles of endurance and secrecy, blended into this new harmony. Time moved gently there, softening the memory of the shadows that had once defined them. The shinobi, now scattered among villages and towns, lived indistinguishably from other people. Their children married into neighbouring families. Their crafts and trades mingled with the ordinary rhythm of society, yet traces of their old life remained in gestures and habits, in the quiet way they moved through a crowd, in the calmness with which they handled uncertainty, in the discipline that governed their households. The art of ninjutsu had ceased to be a profession. but its principles lingered invisibly, a quiet inheritance that shaped character more than action. As peace deepened, the shogunate's reliance on intelligence networks diminished. The old watchmen of the castles, descendants of the Iga and Kōga clans, became ceremonial guards. They attended processions, opened gates, and stood as symbols of vigilance in an age that no longer required it. Some still practiced their techniques in secret. The breathing patterns, the silent movements, the climbing methods that had once defined their ancestors. These were no longer acts of duty, but of remembrance, a way to keep the lineage alive within a world that had forgotten its purpose. The architecture of secrecy faded too. Hidden corridors and trapdoors within castles remained, but few remembered their use. The moats still filled with water, but no spies swam their depths. In the evenings, when lanterns burned within Edo Castle, the corridors that had once carried the silent footsteps of eager watchers echoed only with the soft shuffle of attendants. The shadow that once guarded Japan's unity had fulfilled its role so completely that it erased itself from need. For the Tokugawa shogunate, the maintenance of peace became its greatest strength, and eventually its greatest vulnerability. Isolation from the outside world preserved stability for centuries, but it also enclosed the nation in stillness. The arrival of Western ships in the mid-19th century shattered that calm like a stone breaking water. The air of peace, unbroken for generations, quivered under the weight of change. New technologies, new governments, and new philosophies began to reshape the land. In the shifting light of modernization, the quiet traditions of the shinobi seem like relics from another world. In Iga, small schools still whispered fragments of the old teachings. Some preserved scrolls describing methods of survival, disguise, and observation. A few continued martial practices that emphasized endurance and flexibility. These were no longer acts of espionage, but cultural preservation. To the farmers and townsfolk of the Meiji era, the word ninja was already a curiosity. A word carried by old songs and stories, not by living memory. The last true inheritors of the art passed away quietly, leaving behind no monuments, only names recorded in family ledgers and temples. Yet even as history moved forward, imagination began to look backward. In the cities, storytellers rediscovered the legends of the shadow warriors. Theatres performed plays about mysterious figures who could climb walls, vanish into mist, or outwit entire armies. Poets wrote of unseen heroes whose loyalty transcended death. The world that had forgotten the shinobi now reinvented them in its dreams. What reality had lost, myth reclaimed, the invisible returned, not through silence, but through story. During the Meiji Restoration, as Japan dismantled the feudal order and embraced modern governance, the last remnants of the samurai class faded from power. With them went the structures that had once supported the shinobi. Yet, paradoxically, this was also the moment when fascination with their legend grew stronger. Scholars began to study old texts like the Bansen Shukai and Shoninki, rediscovering their insights into strategy and human nature. Artists and novelists romanticized their exploits, turning pragmatic survivalists into symbols of mystery and freedom. The valleys of Iga and Kōga became quiet pilgrimage sites for those curious about the past. Travelers visited to glimpse the places where the stories had begun, the forests that had hidden entire armies, the mountain passes once guarded by invisible sentinels. Local families, proud of their ancestry, began to preserve relics and manuscripts as pieces of living history. Museums would later rise in these regions, their displays honoring both the fact and the fable of the shinobi. The line between truth and legend blurred until they became inseparable. The art itself, though transformed, survived in spirit through martial traditions that emphasized adaptability and mindfulness. The breathing techniques, meditative practices, and survival skills once used by the shinobi found echoes in modern disciplines. Their philosophy of quiet observation, of moving with rather than against the flow of events, continued to influence Japanese thought in subtle ways. The concept of nin, endurance and patience, endured as a cultural virtue long after the word ninja had become legend. As Japan entered the modern age, its people faced the paradox of remembering what had been designed to remain unseen. The shinobi had lived by erasing their presence, yet their absence had become their legacy. They had disappeared so completely that only their image remained, reflected in art, in story, in the national imagination. To the historians who sought evidence, only fragments could be found, but to the storytellers, those fragments were enough to rebuild a myth as enduring as the mountains themselves. The disappearance of the shinobi was not a single moment, but a long exhalation of centuries. It began with peace, deepened with progress, and concluded with transformation. What was once a living practice became philosophy. What was once secrecy became memory. In this, they achieved what they had always sought: invisibility so complete that it transcended time. In Iga's forests, where the cedar trees grew tall and the mist returned each dawn, life continued quietly. Farmers tended their crops where watchtowers once stood. Children played on paths once used for escape. The earth absorbed every trace of the past until only feeling remained, the faint awareness that something powerful and unseen had once moved there. The wind carried that memory as it passed through the bamboo, the same wind that the shinobi had long ago chosen as their teacher. It whispered the same lesson, that to endure is not always to remain, but sometimes to let go. By the end of the 19th century, Japan had changed beyond recognition. Railways crossed the land. Telegraph wires replaced the secret codes once tied in knots of cord. The new era valued visibility, progress displayed in steel and glass. Yet even in this brightness, the invisible left its mark. The restraint, precision, and quiet diligence that had once defined the shinobi became part of the national spirit they had vanished. Yet their influence lingered in the temperament of a people who prized discipline and harmony above glory. Thus, the age of peace became also the age of disappearance. The shinobi did not fall in battle, nor fade through weakness. They fulfilled their purpose and dissolved into the flow of time. Like the wind that shapes the mountain, but leaves no trace of its path, they became part of the landscape itself, unseen, unending, eternal. And as twilight settled once more over the hills of Iga and Kōga, the valleys glowed with the same soft light that had watched them for centuries. The forests murmured, the streams reflected the fading sky, and the air, gentle and cool, carried the last whisper of a world that had chosen silence over remembrance. A world that had once moved in shadows and now lived peacefully within the heart of history. When history grows quiet, memory begins to dream. As Japan stepped into the modern age, the last embers of the shinobi's real world glowed faintly within the pages of old manuscripts, in half-forgotten family tales, and in the imagination of those who wondered what it must have been like to live unseen. The valleys of Iga and Kōga, once alive with hidden messages and coded signals, became places of reflection, where the wind whispered the difference between what was remembered and what was invented. In that space between truth and myth, the ninja were reborn. The written scrolls of the shinobi, long guarded in secrecy, became the foundation upon which much of their legend would rest. Their authors had not sought fame, they wrote to preserve understanding. Yet as time passed and the practical use of these arts faded, their words took on an air of mystery. When later generations opened the Bansen Shukai, Shoninki, and Nimpiden, they did not see simple manuals of survival, but glimpses into a vanished world. A world where patience and perception could shape destiny. Each of these texts reflected the mind of its time. The Bansen Shukai, written in the late 17th century, was a vast and orderly record of wisdom gathered from Iga and Kōga alike. It catalogued techniques in fire, water, disguise, and infiltration with scholarly care. Yet hidden between its lines was philosophy, lessons about integrity, clarity, and the avoidance of cruelty. Its anonymous compiler, Fujibayashi Yasutake, had understood that the greatest danger to the shinobi was not discovery by others, but deception of oneself. In his words, the art of invisibility became indistinguishable from the art of humility. The Shoninki, written by Natori Masazumi, reflected the maturity of a culture at peace. It was not a field manual for spies, but a moral treatise on sincerity and mindfulness. Its author, once a retainer of a feudal house, lamented the way his contemporaries misunderstood ninjutsu as mere trickery. He urged his readers to pursue purity of intention, to use cunning only in service of justice to Natori. Deception was a last resort. The true path of the shinobi was guided by honesty and control of the self. His tone was that of a teacher addressing the conscience of his age. The third of the great scrolls, the Nimpiden, carried the air of legend even in its own time. Attributed to the lineage of Hattori Hanzo, it was less a manual than a family record, blending instruction with secrecy. Some parts were written in coded language, others lost entirely to time. It spoke of the importance of transmission. That knowledge should pass only from master to disciple, never through ambition or greed. Its closing lines were a prayer, that wisdom used for destruction would bring ruin, but wisdom used for harmony would preserve the world. In those words, the philosophy of the shinobi reached its quietest and most enduring truth. For centuries, these scrolls rested unseen, kept in temple archives or hidden in private homes. Only scholars, monks, or descendants of the old clans knew of their existence. But when the Meiji era opened Japan to the wider world, curiosity turned toward the past. Historians, poets, and travelers sought to rediscover the stories of the hidden people who had shaped the nation's turbulent centuries. The scrolls were studied, translated, and discussed. What had once been secret became heritage. The shinobi, once erased, returned as symbols of Japan's resilience and mystery. Yet as their image spread, reality grew softer around its edges. Theatre troupes and storytellers transformed the patient observer into a figure of speed and magic. The stage demanded spectacle, and so the unseen became visible in brilliant displays of illusion. Actors dressed in black robes leapt from behind curtains, vanishing into smoke with a puff of ash or a hidden trapdoor. These performances captured the imagination of common audiences, turning the quiet discipline of the ninja into something wondrous. The people called them Kuroko ninja, the invisible stagehands, who became visible legends. By the early 20th century, as Japan embraced modern industry and looked back on its feudal past with nostalgia, the image of the ninja had become a cultural treasure. Painters and writers depicted them as solitary figures standing beneath the moon, silent and noble. Their weapons, once tools of necessity, became emblems of artistry. Their black garments, originally the attire of stage assistants, became the universal costume of invisibility. The transformation was complete. The humble shinobi, once a quiet servant of circumstance, had ascended into myth. Yet beneath these new imaginings, the truth of the scrolls endured. Those who read them deeply understood that the heart of ninjutsu was not deception or violence, but perception, a way of seeing the world without being blinded by it. The old writings taught awareness of detail, patience in action, and purity of intention. They spoke of nature as ally, of calm as power, and of endurance as the highest virtue. In an age of noise and invention, these lessons found new resonance. The scrolls, once guides for survival, became guides for living. The valleys that had birthed the art of the shinobi became keepers of its memory. In Iga and Kōga, small museums began to appear in the 20th century, preserving tools, maps, and manuscripts. Visitors could walk through reconstructed houses with hidden doors and narrow passageways, reminders of how the invisible had once moved among the visible. Scholars compared folklore with historical record, tracing which tales had roots in truth and which were flowers of imagination. The boundary between history and legend remained uncertain, but the reverence was sincere. For the people of these regions, the legacy of the ninja was never about spectacle. It was about perseverance, the quiet pride of a people who had survived through adaptability and humility, even as the world beyond Japan turned their ancestors into symbols of mystery and adventure. The families of Iga and Kōga tended their graves, cared for the old temples, and continued to live by the principles of diligence and restraint. Their heritage had transformed, but it had not been lost. As the decades passed, the myth traveled farther. Books, films, and tales carried the ninja into the imaginations of people across the world. Their image became fluid, part history, part fiction, yet always touched by that original idea of endurance. What began as survival within mountain mists became a universal symbol of focus and quiet power. The scrolls had outlived their original readers, but their words had succeeded in what all true knowledge seeks. They had transcended purpose and become wisdom. In every generation, the shinobi found new life, in stories, in art, and in the quiet minds of those who admired their discipline. The scrolls were the seed, the legends the bloom. Between them flowed the same invisible thread that had always guided the path of the ninja, the ability to adapt without losing essence, to endure without demanding recognition. The written words of Iga and Kōga had preserved more than instruction. They had preserved a spirit. And though centuries had turned their practical wisdom into legend, the heartbeat of that spirit still sounded softly through time, steady, patient, and enduring, like the rustle of wind through bamboo. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world that had once belonged to the shinobi had vanished, leaving behind only traces of ink, whispered stories, and the imagination of those who longed for mystery. What had begun as a quiet discipline of survival in mist-shrouded valleys had become a symbol of enigma and power, shaped less by memory than by myth. The ninja, once a figure who moved unseen, now walked vividly through the dreams of a modern age. The shift began gently, as all myths do. During the late Edo period, traveling storytellers, yomihon narrators, and kabuki playwrights brought tales of intrigue to the stage. They drew upon fragments of real events, turning history into performance. Their heroes crept across painted backdrops of moonlit castles. Their villains plotted in shadows that shimmered with candlelight. To audiences who had grown up in peace, these stories were glimpses into a romantic past filled with danger and cunning. The shinobi became characters, their quiet patience reborn as theatrical grace. In these performances, the image of the ninja began to solidify. The black costume, unknown to the real practitioners, came from the attire of stage assistants, kuroko, who dressed in dark clothing to symbolize invisibility. When these figures suddenly appeared as assassins or heroes, the effect was electric. A costume designed for invisibility became the universal symbol of it. From that moment onward, the color of darkness belonged to the ninja. As the Meiji era opened Japan to the world, writers began to capture this fascination in literature. Stories of loyalty, espionage, and impossible feats filled serialized novels and illustrated pamphlets. Some authors portrayed the ninja as protectors of justice. Others cast them as silent avengers, heirs of a secret wisdom lost to modernity. The tales carried a trace of longing, a sense that the discipline and self-mastery of the past had something to teach a restless, industrializing nation. The shinobi, who had once served to maintain balance during chaos, now symbolized balance amid progress. Outside Japan, fascination grew quickly. Western travelers and scholars, drawn to the mystery of the East, wrote accounts that mixed observation with imagination. They described the ninja as magical warriors, invisible assassins who could vanish in a puff of smoke or control elements with a gesture. Though these depictions bore little resemblance to the truth, they carried a kind of poetic respect. The idea of a person who moved without being seen, who triumphed through knowledge rather than strength, appealed to imaginations far beyond Japan's borders. In the early 20th century, as Japan entered the modern world stage, filmmakers and illustrators rediscovered these stories. Silent films portrayed agile figures leaping across rooftops, their movements framed by the pale glow of the moon. Popular novels turned their exploits into serialized adventures, filled with secret tunnels and dramatic escapes. The shinobi had become larger than life, yet within the exaggeration remained a faint echo of their true philosophy: adaptability, patience, and the mastery of self. Within Japan, the old regions of Iga and Kōga watch this transformation with mixed feelings. The descendants of the historical clans, living quiet lives as farmers and craftsmen, saw their ancestors turned into legends of smoke and fire. Yet they also recognized that myth had preserved what time might have erased. The name ninja had returned to the lips of the world, carried not by armies or emperors, but by stories. The valleys that had once hidden warriors now welcomed visitors who came seeking traces of the unseen. The past, once secret, had become heritage. Over the decades, the image of the ninja grew ever more diverse. To some, they became symbols of discipline and control, spiritual heirs of the samurai ethos. To others, They embodied freedom and rebellion, individuals who answered to no master, surviving by their own wits. This duality mirrored the truth of their origins. The shinobi had always lived between categories, neither holy soldier nor peasant, neither hero nor villain. The legend had captured that ambiguity perfectly. In myth, they could be anything. In memory, they could belong to everyone. The post-war era expanded their legend even further. Japan's recovery brought renewed interest in its cultural roots, and the ninja once again stepped into the public imagination, not as ghosts of a feudal past, but as figures of creativity and inspiration. Novelists and filmmakers of the 1950s and 60s turned them into icons of mystery and mastery. Comic artists, captivated by their agility and secret codes, reimagined them for new generations. The image of the ninja traveled swiftly beyond Japan's shores, carried by cinema, television, and art. In these new forms, the shinobi no longer belonged only to history. They became global archetypes, symbols of stealth, endurance, and quiet strength. From pulp novels to modern films, from stage performances to children's stories, the ninja evolved endlessly, adapting to every culture that adopted them. In the West, they appeared as shadows of freedom. In Japan, as reminders of a disciplined past. Each retelling reshaped them, yet none could erase their core, the belief that true power lies in control of the self. Behind these myths, scholars continued to rediscover the truth. The study of ninjutsu as a historical discipline gained momentum, with researchers piecing together records from the Tokugawa archives and local chronicles museums in Iga and Kōga, curated exhibits of ancient tools, scrolls, and writings, inviting visitors to step into the quieter reality behind the legends. They showed that the shinobi were not supernatural beings, but human beings who had mastered patience and perception to an extraordinary degree. Their story, stripped of fantasy, was no less remarkable. Within the culture itself, the ninja's transformation reflected something profound about Japan's relationship with its past. The legend was not mere entertainment. It was a dialogue between memory and identity. The figure of the ninja embodied traits that the Japanese spirit had long valued: endurance, adaptability, and the harmony between intellect and action. In every retelling, whether exaggerated or reverent, those qualities remained at the heart of the myth. The outward form changed. The essence endured. As the 20th century advanced, the ninja stepped firmly into global consciousness. Films and television introduced them to audiences across continents, often reimagined through the lens of fantasy and heroism. Yet even in these bright retellings, a subtle truth persisted: that silence, discipline, and patience held power beyond force. The old teachings, once hidden in ink and wood, now reach millions through story and art. In this way, the shinobi achieved a form of immortality that no warlord or empire could ever claim. Back in the valleys of Iga and Kōga, the nights remained as they had always been, filled with wind, whispering leaves, and the quiet hum of insects. Tourists walked the narrow paths where shadows once moved, unaware that the very air they breathed carried centuries of unseen history. Beneath their feet lay soil that had felt the weight of the old master's steps. The legends had grown vast and dazzling, but their roots were still here, deep within the quiet earth. The real ninja had vanished, but their memory had not faded. It had multiplied. Every myth, every retelling, every act of wonder kept them alive. The shadow had become light, and the unseen had become universal. Across centuries and continents, they continued to move, not through the dark corridors of castles, but through the imagination of humankind. Their true victory was never in the wars they fought, but in the endurance of their spirit. A spirit that could change form endlessly, yet never disappear. The ninja lived on, not as ghosts of a forgotten age, but as reflections of something timeless within us all. The quiet power of patience, awareness, and the will to endure. When the world began to grow smaller, carried by steamships, railways, and telegraphs, Japan's long-sealed past opened to foreign eyes. Travelers from the West arrived on its shores in the late 19th century, drawn by curiosity and wonder at a culture that had preserved its traditions in isolation. They saw temples of quiet beauty, cities of intricate craft, and a people who moved with precision and grace. Among the countless discoveries that fascinated them, one figure captured imagination more than most. The unseen warrior known only through rumor and legend, the ninja. Western fascination with the ninja began not through direct encounter, but through fragments of story. Early visitors heard local tales of spies and shadow fighters from guides and interpreters, who themselves repeated what had been passed down for generations to foreign ears. These accounts sounded like fables. Invisible men, masters of disguise, agents of silence. They fit neatly into the romantic image of an ancient East filled with secrets. Newspapers and travelogues carried these impressions home, blending observation with invention. The myth of the ninja had begun its long journey westward. Writers of the Victorian era were especially drawn to mystery. Explorers and scholars translated Japanese texts and legends, often embellishing what they did not fully understand. In their retellings, the ninja became almost supernatural. Sorcerers who could walk on water, control minds, or vanish into thin air. The real discipline of patience and stealth transformed into a spectacle of magic and exotic intrigue. Though inaccurate, these early portrayals reflected a kind of admiration. The idea that mastery of self could create seemingly impossible power fascinated the industrial world, where noise and speed ruled. The Western discovery of the ninja paralleled another fascination, that of the samurai. To foreign eyes, these two figures represented opposing faces of Japan's spirit. The samurai as the noble warrior of honor, the ninja as the elusive master of secrecy. Together, they formed a symbolic harmony. Light and shadow, code and cunning, visible strength and invisible intelligence. Writers describe them as complementary forces within a single civilization, each necessary to understand the other. The samurai's sword cut openly. The ninja's path flowed unseen. Both reflected discipline, but in different forms. As the 20th century advanced, these impressions deepened through art and film. The early decades saw Japan and the West exchanging not only goods, but ideas. Novelists and historians in Europe and America began to explore Japanese themes, inspired by translated works and the vivid imagery of ukiyo-e prints. The ninja appeared in adventure stories and serial publications, often as mysterious antagonists or guides of hidden wisdom. They were no longer local figures. They had become symbols of the universal allure of the unknown. In Japan itself, cinema gave new life to the legend. Silent films of the 1910s and 1920s portrayed the ninja as agile, enigmatic figures who embodied the spirit of old Japan in a rapidly changing world. Their movements, choreographed with elegance, reflected both danger and discipline. As Japanese film began to influence global audiences, these images traveled abroad. Western filmmakers, inspired by the blend of beauty and secrecy, reinterpreted the ninja for their own stories. What had once been a regional legend now entered the shared mythology of the modern age. After the Second World War, the exchange intensified. Japan rebuilt itself with remarkable speed, and its culture, both traditional and modern, began to captivate the world. Western scholars studying Japanese martial arts encountered references to ninjutsu and sought to learn its secrets. A few Japanese masters, aware of this growing curiosity, began to teach simplified or philosophical versions of the art to foreign students. Through these encounters, the concept of the ninja moved from legend into living practice once more, though reshaped to fit a global imagination hungry for mystery and meaning. By the 1960s, Western cinema and literature had begun to reinvent the ninja in striking new forms. They appeared in spy thrillers, martial arts novels, and popular magazines, their abilities exaggerated to superhuman levels. Black robes and throwing stars became visual shorthand for stealth and mastery. Though far from historical truth, these portrayals resonated deeply. In an age defined by technology and surveillance, the idea of a human being who could remain unseen, who could master the invisible, spoke to modern fears and desires alike. The ancient art of patience had found a new home in the modern age of speed. In Japan, this global fascination reflected back like a mirror. The ninja, once peripheral in their own country's history, became ambassadors of its culture. Comic books, television series and films portrayed them as both heroes and symbols of tradition. Some stories drew on authentic philosophies of endurance and humility. Others embraced fantasy entirely. The boundary between fact and fiction blurred again, just as it had in the old kabuki stages. Yet beneath the spectacle, a quiet respect endured. The true heritage of the shinobi, their discipline, adaptability, and humanity, remained visible to those who looked closely. Museums in Iga and Kōga, once local curiosities, gained international attention. Visitors from across the world came to walk through reconstructed ninja houses, their walls hiding secret doors and passages. Scholars study ancient manuscripts, comparing myth to reality. They discovered that behind the exaggerations lay a history both more ordinary and more profound, one of villagers and monks who had turned observation into art. Their legacy was not of magic, but of awareness. The Western world, eager for wonder, had rediscovered something even deeper, the beauty of the unseen. The exchange of ideas flowed both ways. Western interpretations influenced Japanese popular culture, and Japanese depictions in turn shaped the global image. From cinema to animation, from novels to stage performances, the ninja evolved with each retelling. They became symbols of individual mastery, self-control, and transcendence. In the 1980s, as martial arts culture spread worldwide, their figure became iconic, a bridge between East and West. Past and present, the unseen warriors of medieval Japan now moved across screens and pages, their silence translated into every language. Yet amidst this vast transformation, a quiet truth persisted. The fascination that surrounded the ninja was not merely about stealth or combat. It was about the longing for balance, the wish to live with awareness in a noisy world. The Western discovery had amplified the legend, but it had also revealed its essence. The ancient lessons of patience, perception, and harmony resonated across cultures because they belonged not to one people, but to human nature itself. In time, the ninja ceased to belong to history or geography. They became part of the collective imagination, a universal archetype of wisdom hidden beneath simplicity. The Western discovery had not merely revived their story. It had carried their spirit into new forms, where it could continue to inspire. Their journey from misty valleys to global consciousness mirrored the essence of their philosophy: quiet movement, endless transformation, and enduring presence through change. As the world moved into the modern era, filled with light, sound, and speed, the image of the ninja endured as a shadow at its edge, graceful, patient, and timeless. They had crossed borders without armies, spoken across languages without words, and taught endurance through myth. In this way, the old masters of invisibility achieved the ultimate act of endurance: to remain unseen, yet always remembered. And so the Western discovery was never truly discovery at all. It was recognition. Recognition of something ancient within the human heart, the stillness that survives beneath all noise, the clarity that endures within all chaos, and the quiet truth that some forms of strength require no witness at all. By the late 20th century, the ninja had crossed every border of time, language, and imagination. What had begun in the quiet mountains of Iga and Kōga as a discipline of survival had become one of the world's most recognizable symbols. A figure both ancient and eternal, shaped anew by each generation. The shadow had returned, not to battlefields or castle corridors, but to screens, books, and the restless dreams of a global audience, the shinobi, who once survived through silence, now lived through story. The modern rediscovery of the ninja began during Japan's post-war years. The devastation of conflict had left the nation rebuilding both its cities and its spirit. In that atmosphere, filmmakers and writers turned to history for meaning. The stories of those who had endured through cunning and resilience spoke powerfully to a society seeking identity. During the 1950s and 60s, cinema reawakened the legend directors such as Akira Kurosawa and others explored the tension between honor and survival, between visible strength and hidden intelligence. Though many of their films focused on samurai, the figure of the ninja lingered at the edges of those narratives. Silent, disciplined, waiting. Soon, entire genres formed around them. Japanese studios produced films that transformed the ninja into both historical figure and mythic hero. Cloaked in darkness, they moved through dramatic tales of loyalty and betrayal, their faces half seen beneath the moonlight. Television followed, bringing serialized adventures into homes. Children watched with fascination as these unseen warriors scaled walls, threw stars, and vanished into smoke. What had once been whispered by storytellers in candlelight was now broadcast in flickering images across a bright, modern nation. As Japan's popular culture flourished, the ninja found new life in art and imagination. Manga and anime reinterpreted the ancient ideals of endurance and transformation for younger generations. In these stories, the shinobi became explorers of human potential, symbols of perseverance, friendship, and moral choice. The elements that had defined their philosophy, patience, adaptability, self-mastery, returned, not as secret tactics, but as universal lessons. The idea that true power came from balance and awareness resonated far beyond the world of fiction. Beneath the masks and mystique, the ninja's ancient wisdom had found its way into modern hearts. Meanwhile, the fascination that had begun in the West decades earlier deepened into cultural phenomenon. The 1970s and 80s saw the arrival of ninja cinema across Europe and America, where directors transformed the image of the shadow warrior into something both thrilling and symbolic. Black-clad figures appeared in action films, comic books, and martial arts schools. Though often far from historical reality, these portrayals captured the imagination of a generation that admired quiet strength in an age of noise. The ninja became a mirror for modern yearning, a reminder that knowledge, discipline, and calm could triumph in a chaotic world. Martial arts practitioners in the West sought to rediscover ninjutsu itself. Teachers who traced their lineage to old Japanese schools began sharing their knowledge abroad, blending physical training with meditation and philosophy. Students learned not only techniques of movement, but principles of awareness and adaptability, echoes of lessons taught in Iga's forest centuries before. For many, the study of the ninja became a spiritual journey, a way to reconnect with simplicity and mindfulness in a world driven by speed. The discipline that once protected hidden valleys now offered refuge to those seeking stillness of mind. In Japan, the government and local communities began to recognize the enduring appeal of the ninja as part of the nation's cultural identity. The towns of Iga and Kōga established museums, festivals, and historical reenactments celebrating their heritage. Locals dressed in traditional garb, performing demonstrations of climbing, stealth, and ancient tools. Visitors walked through reconstructed homes with sliding panels, hidden compartments, and trapdoors, experiencing the ingenuity of the old ways firsthand. The ninja, once guardians of secrecy, had become ambassadors of culture, symbols of Japan's ability to blend mystery and modernity. Despite the spectacle, the core message of the shinobi remained. Beneath the entertainment and display, the true power of the ninja continued to lie in discipline, humility, and quiet understanding. Many martial artists, historians, and teachers emphasized this in their work. They reminded their students and audiences that the essence of nin, endurance, patience, and compassion, could still guide modern life. The shinobi had been soldiers once, but their philosophy transcended warfare. It spoke instead of awareness, of knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to let go. In literature and film, the ninja evolved once again. They became not only warriors, but metaphors for transformation, individuals who moved between worlds, between light and shadow, tradition and change. In Japanese cinema, they reflected the nation's shifting identity, the struggle to honor the past while embracing the future. In global culture, they represented freedom from boundaries, the possibility of self-mastery in a world that often felt uncontrollable. Whether silent protector or solitary wanderer, the figure of the ninja spoke to a shared human desire to be both strong and unseen, powerful yet at peace. As the 21st century dawned, technology carried their image into new forms. Video games and digital media introduced the ninja to millions, reimagining them in vivid worlds of color and sound. Their skills, agility, perception, adaptability, found resonance in modern values of creativity and focus. Even in virtual form, the lessons of patience and mindfulness endured. The ancient art of awareness had adapted once again, moving from ink to screen, from scroll to circuit, without losing its rhythm. In the real world, the influence of the ninja lingered in subtle ways. the concept of stealth found new life in fields as diverse as design, strategy, and technology. The quiet intelligence of observation inspired thinkers and artists alike. In Japan, the term ninja began to appear in unexpected places as a symbol of dedication, skill, and invisible efficiency. Office workers, athletes, and innovators adopted the word playfully, honoring a legacy that had long outgrown its origins. The shinobi had become a metaphor for excellence, pursued without spectacle. Through all these transformations, the essence of the ninja remained remarkably constant. They had survived not through conquest, but through adaptation, through the ability to change shape without losing substance. Their image, endlessly renewed, continued to embody qualities that the modern world often overlooked: patience, humility, and awareness of the unseen. What began as survival in mist and silence had become a universal reminder that wisdom often hides behind simplicity. As night falls over the 21st century world, the spirit of the shinobi still moves, not through forests or castles, but through imagination and thought. Their story continues in every quiet act of endurance, every moment of calm in the midst of noise. The tools have changed, but the discipline remains. The wind that once guided their footsteps through the valleys of Iga now moves unseen through time, whispering the same lesson to every generation: that true mastery is gentle and true strength is silent. The shadow has returned not as fear, but as presence. Invisible, yet everywhere. Ancient, yet timeless. The shinobi live on, not in hiding, but in the stillness between motion, in the balance between knowledge and humility, in the enduring patience of those who move quietly through the noise of the modern world. Night returns softly to the mountains of Iga and Kōga. The world has changed beyond recognition. Cities rise where rice fields once rippled. Electric lights glow where moonlight alone once guided travelers. Yet the wind still moves through the cedar forests with the same quiet persistence it held 1,000 years ago. The air carries no sound of battle, no whisper of alarm, only the faint murmur of streams winding through the valleys. And in that sound, faint but enduring, lives the final echo of the shinobi, a presence that was never meant to disappear, only to become invisible. History had folded their story into its pages, yet the philosophy they carried slipped between the lines, surviving in the silence between events. They had walked through centuries of fire and peace, adapting with every change, enduring without fame. Now, when their image belongs to both history and dream, what remains is not the weapon, nor the mask, nor the myth, but the quiet lesson that endurance itself is a kind of enlightenment. To the shinobi, invisibility was never about vanishing from the world, but moving within it without disturbance. Their path was the art of harmony, to act precisely, to observe patiently, to influence without leaving trace. In that they mirrored the rhythm of nature, the way water shapes stone not by force, but by persistence, the way wind bends the forest without breaking it. Their legacy was not a single act or invention, but a way of being, an understanding that gentleness can carry strength and that silence can speak. The long centuries of warfare that had birthed their art are long past, yet their wisdom continues to whisper in subtler forms. It lingers in the discipline of artists, in the awareness of craftsmen, in the quiet observation of those who choose precision over spectacle. The modern world, restless and illuminated, has little space for shadows, yet it still honors their essence whenever patience is practiced, whenever restraint becomes strength. The shinobi live not as figures of the past, but as reflections of a universal truth. That mastery begins not in motion, but in stillness. In Iga, the evening settles over the tiled roofs of houses that trace their lineage back to those long-ago watchers. Children play on streets where hidden paths once wound through bamboo. A museum light flickers, illuminating tools once carried by hands long gone. A small hook, a folded scroll, a blade dulled by time. Visitors pass quietly through, some moved by curiosity, others by something harder to name, a sense of reverence for what cannot be seen. The air feels heavy with memory, but peaceful, as if the land itself remembers how to breathe slowly. Far beyond these valleys, the idea of the ninja has taken countless forms. They have become symbols of mystery, of self-control, of the power that moves unseen. They appear in films, stories, and dreams, yet beneath every portrayal, however fantastic, lies the same ancient foundation, the endurance of those who learn to live quietly in an unquiet world. Through the endless retellings, the spirit of the shinobi continues to evolve, shaped not by the need to be remembered, but by the inevitability of being rediscovered. Every generation finds them anew, because every generation needs what they represent. In times of uncertainty, their patience becomes guidance. In times of noise, their silence becomes comfort. The world looks to them not for violence, but for balance, for the reminder that clarity, compassion, and observation remain the surest forms of strength. Their teachings may no longer wear armor or move through darkness, but they live wherever awareness is practiced, in the steady hands of a surgeon, in the focus of a calligrapher, in the breath of one who pauses before they act. Their philosophy, preserved through centuries of transformation, can be distilled into a single truth: that survival and peace come not from domination, but from harmony. The shinobi knew that to control oneself was to master circumstance, that to endure was to triumph. In this, they left a gift greater than their techniques, a map of the inner landscape, guiding those who seek to live with balance amid chaos. The scrolls and stories were merely vessels. The real art was always invisible, carried within the mind. It is said that true silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of understanding. So it was with the ninja. They listened to the world until they could move through it without resistance. They watched until nothing surprised them. Their patience was not passivity, but readiness, a quiet alertness that allowed them to act at exactly the right moment. This quality, timeless and human, is what has allowed their legacy to outlast empires. Where others sought glory, they sought awareness, and in doing so, they found eternity. Now, as the modern age races onward, their image glides gently alongside it. In art, in philosophy, in metaphor, they stand not as reminders of secrecy, but of mindfulness. The old word nin, once meaning endurance, has expanded to describe the quiet strength needed to move through life itself. It belongs not only to warriors, but to all who choose patience over haste, purpose over noise. The path of the shadow has become a path of light, subtle, enduring, and infinite. If one were to walk through the forests of Iga at dusk, when the sun fades and the mist begins to rise, the landscape would seem unchanged. The stones are still cool beneath the moss, The air carries the same scent of cedar and rain. Perhaps in that hour when day becomes night, one could almost sense the presence of those who once moved here, not as ghosts, but as memory itself, folded gently into the land. Their footsteps are gone, yet the rhythm remains. The silence they practiced still fills the valleys, teaching without words. In that silence lies the final meaning of their journey. The shinobi were never creatures of darkness, but of balance. They did not live to destroy, but to preserve, not to vanish, but to see without being seen. Their endurance was not a refusal of the world, but a deep acceptance of its impermanence. They understood what few ever grasp, that to live in harmony with the unseen currents of life is to become part of something that does not end. As the night deepens over the hills, the stars reflect in the waters of old rice terraces, shimmering softly like the eyes of centuries watching from above. The world sleeps. The wind moves gently through the bamboo, carrying the faint sound of leaves brushing against one another. It is the same sound that has followed humanity since before memory, the sound of time moving, patient and eternal. And in that sound, somewhere between history and dream, the shinobi remain, not as shadows, but as silence, not as warriors, but as wisdom. Their path stretches beyond the ages, a quiet, unseen thread woven through the heart of humanity itself. So sleep now, beneath the same sky that once guided them. Let the wind carry their story into your breath, soft, steady, and calm. For in the end, the path of the shadow was never about vanishing. It was always about learning to be still in the light,